Okay, so I think we're ready to go. Scott and Maya, you ready to go? Great, welcome everyone. Good evening. I'm Helena Andraco. I'm on the board of the Lower East Side Preservation Initiative, otherwise known as LESPI, and I'm delighted to welcome you this evening to a program that I know that you're really going to enjoy, that will take us on a virtual tour of the beautiful Eldridge Street Synagogue and the historic Lower East Side. Our tour will be led by our virtual tour guide, Scott Brevda, of the museum at Eldridge Street. For those of you who aren't familiar with LESPI, we're a not-for-profit group started in 2007, whose mission is the preservation of the historic Lower East Side. And that includes the East Village, the Lower East Side below Houston Street, Chinatown, Little Italy, and the Bowery. We focus on advocating for the New York City Landmarks Commission to designate new historic districts and individual landmarks in the Lower East Side. We do this through meetings, submissions of requests for evaluation to the commission, and through outreach and education through programs such as our presentation this evening. So during our program, we're going to invite you to submit your questions in the Q&A, which you should see at the bottom of your screen. We'll be holding off on answering the questions, however, until the end of the program. But at that time, we'll do our best to answer as many questions as we possibly can. So at this point, I'd like to turn our program over to Maya Locker, who is the Public Programs and Special Events Coordinator for the museum at Eldridge Street. Welcome, Maya.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much to everyone at LESPI who helped us in putting this together. It's so nice to be doing this on the LESPI webinar series. Good evening, everyone. Like Lena said, my name is Maya Locker, and I run the programs and events at the museum at Eldridge Street. Thank you so much for joining us for this Zoom program for the Lower East Side Preservation's webinar series. And for those of you who haven't visited us before at the museum at Eldridge Street, we are housed in the historic Eldridge Street Synagogue, as you'll hear from Scott in this virtual tour. Built in 1887, it was the first grand synagogue built by Eastern European Jews. It was nearly lost to neglect, but we've brought it back with our massive restoration project and offer in-person and virtual programming at Eldridge Street to tell the story of immigrant life, explore architecture, and inspire reflection on cultural exchange and continuity. And I'm going to, in a minute, put this link in the chat for our other public programming, eldridgestreet.org/events. You can find our whole events calendar, and you can see concerts, virtual programs, panel discussions, all of that in our events calendar, and see what's coming up. I'm going to highlight just a few programs that we have coming up at Eldridge Street. This Sunday, we have a panel discussion and a choral performance all about the remarkable women of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire and the activism that followed. You can get more information on our events calendar. On March 10th, we're really kicking off Women's History Month here at Eldridge Street. We have a Mamas with Chutzpah walking tour. We'll hear more about the incredible women on the historic Lower East Side. And on March 12th, if you're not local, we have a virtual program exploring art history through Frida Kahlo and her Jewish connections. And again, our events calendar can be accessed through eldridgestreet.org/events, and I'll put that link in the chat. And with that, I'd like to introduce you all to our wonderful presenter tonight, my coworker, Scott Brevda. Scott is the Senior Manager for Education and Accessibility at the museum at Eldridge Street. And as a historian, museum educator, and lifelong New Yorker, he loves to bring the history of his native city to life. In his current position, Scott plans and leads the museum's cultural after-school adventure program with local public school students. He creates new educational content and programming. And he was formerly a senior educator at the Lower East Side Tenement Museum and holds a BA and MA in history from Fordham University. And with that, I will turn this program over to Scott. Thank you so much, Scott, and thank you so much, LESPI, for having us.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'll add my thanks to it, and I'm really been looking forward to this program and taking you all on this tour for many weeks now. As Maya and has been said this evening, we're going to be going for actually a two-part tour. We're going to be starting with an inside view of our historic synagogue, the Eldridge Street Synagogue, which is the oldest grand house of worship built by Eastern European Jews here in the United States. And then we'll also be going for a little walking tour through the neighborhood, looking at a number of the landmark sites that really help make up the history and character of the neighborhood, both 100 years ago and today. Our story, while it will be centering on the Lower East Side itself, it actually begins on the other side of the world in a century ago in Eastern Europe, in areas that include nations that are today Ukraine, Poland, Belarus, parts of the Baltic states, and Hungary and Romania. This was Eastern Europe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In this region, there were, until the 1790s, there were about 4 great empires that governed the vast tracts of land and the millions of people that lived inside of it. They were the Prussian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. In the late 1700s, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was divided up or partitioned by the other 3. And each empire and the absolute monarchs that governed them would have to find their own unique way of bringing this new territory and the population in that territory into their existing holdings. The czars of Russia, emperors and autocrats, had a rather unique way of handling this new population, particularly the Jewish population, which was in such concentrations in the former Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. As you see on the map here, the area in the light beige was the Tsar's solution. This was the Pale of Settlement. An area of restriction, Russia's Jews were allowed to live only within the Pale. They were barred from Smolensk, Moscow, St. Petersburg, and the other great cities of the empire. Confined into little shtetls that dotted the Pale, Russia's Jews were further limited by restrictions on what occupations they could hold, what education they could receive, and how many students could be at university at any one time. The intent was to keep the Jewish population of Russia in the same economic and social status as they had always been, confined into the borderlands of the empire, unable to move upward, unable to grow their wealth, influence, and families in the way they may have wanted to. The worst part about life in the Pale, however, was not these economic restrictions, but rather pogroms. These random and often systematic attacks on Jewish villages in the Pale often happened around Easter and Christmas through most of the 19th century in Eastern Europe. But in 1881, when our story really begins to get underway, these pogroms began to get worse, more violent, more numerous, more destructive. It was in that year that the Tsar Alexander II was assassinated. His killers had come from all walks of life within Russia, from many different constituencies and communities. But the Jews of the empire, having very little to do with the assassination, took most of the blame. The pogroms that we see in the years that follow, 1882, 83, and 84, were far more violent and destructive than the ones previous, and they were also far more numerous and clustered together. Russian officials, both civilian and military, refused to lend any support to Russia's Jews trapped within the Pale. One military official in the area around Kyiv, the modern capital of Ukraine, when he was approached by the local Jewish community and asked to call out the troops under his command to protect their homes, businesses, and synagogues and their families from what they feared was coming, the governor refused. He was quoted in the New York Times and the Times of London, stating that he would not disturb his men for a pack of Jews. That quote, in some ways for me, rings through the centuries, because when you think about that quote, and specifically the word pack, a word not often used to describe people, it gives you a sense of the perceptions of many at that time. It is perhaps understandable why 1/3 of Europe's Jewish community would cross the Atlantic over the following 40 years. From about 1880 to 1924. This population was crossing the Atlantic in greater numbers than New York City had ever seen. It was a larger movement of peoples than in the decades prior, when German immigrants from moved into Kleine Deutschland, or the Lower East Side as it's now, looking for a new life and new opportunities. These immigrants were packed with ships in some ways lining up across the Atlantic to bring them to America. Most would go through Ellis Island, while others would go through other ports of call like Boston or Philadelphia. But it was here in New York, and specifically the Lower East Side, that this community would begin their new life in this country. It was in the Lower East Side that they would begin to put the pieces together, to find at first a home, to find work, to find resources that they could potentially use down the line to build something bigger and better. For the meantime, however, it was to the Lower East Side that this community looked. And over the years that would follow, the mass movement of peoples would turn this area into the most densely packed area, not just in the city or in this country, but in the world. This image you're seeing on the screen is Orchard Street in 1898. It's what I describe, only half joking, as a quiet day on the Lower East Side, for indeed it was. This street was typical of most streets in the neighborhood in this era, packed with people, push carts, horses, and the goods that they were trying to sell or buy, as the case may be. Every street and avenue looked this way. If you can imagine for a moment Times Square, as densely packed as it is, imagine that the streets in your neighborhood was like Times Square, just, of course, without the Alamos. This was the Lower East Side in that period. The apartment buildings which flank this street were just as crowded. The tenement apartments, which would become notorious in later decades, was packed to capacity with countless people. On the average, you would see about 300 to 400 square feet per apartment, with an average of 10 to 12 people in each. And that's assuming they didn't lease out a bedroom or a living room or a kitchen to another family to help make ends meet. In this environment, it's not surprising that the first synagogues that they would build were not the most grand affairs. Many of them were like, as you see on the left-hand side, a shtibel, a storefront synagogue, which could be in the basement of a building, in a storefront, or even in a living room. This kind of synagogue was a place where the congregation was trying to find a place to observe their service, observe their customs and traditions, practice their faith in a space that wasn't too expensive, that wasn't taxing on their limited resources. Eventually, the community, as they began to lay down roots, as they began to find economic stability, they would look to pre-existing buildings to house their congregations. On the right-hand side of the screen, you see a beautiful example of the Bialystoker Synagogue, still here with us in the Lower East Side today. This building, of course, did not begin its life as the Bialystok Synagogue. It had been a German church in the Kleine Deutschland period of the neighborhood. As the German community moved up to what is today Yorkville on the Upper East Side, the new community that was entering purchased the space and repurposed it. By the late 1880s, however, the community was looking to put down more permanent roots, to build something of their own, in some ways to even make a statement that they had permanently arrived here in America, and that they were laying down structures akin to what you would find in St. Patrick's Cathedral and St. John the Divine, something that denoted their presence. That was the function our building served. The Eldridge Street Synagogue was the first grand synagogue built by Eastern European Jews, the first purpose-built Ashkenazi synagogue in America. It took 9 months to build at a cost of about $91,000. I know those two facts seem slightly incredible. Today, as I'm sure you all involved in preservation know, it takes far longer than 9 months just to get building permits today. But they managed to build the structure in 9 months and at a cost of $91,000. That's about 2.5 to 3 million. The structure that they would build was something akin to what you would have found in Eastern Europe at the time, in the grand cities of Europe, in Warsaw, Vienna, Budapest, Frankfurt, and Munich. We can see from the facade the elements pulled from across the Atlantic, captured by that era's fascination with Sephardic history, with this history of the Jewish Spanish community in Spain and Portugal. The Moorish Revival architecture of the building is clear in the horseshoe windows, the horseshoe frames around the windows, and the finials and detail work on the top of the building. There are also, of course, Romanesque and Gothic features, such as the Romanesque keyhole windows on the second floor and the rose window, the main window on this facade. But by and large, this space, while meant to be beautiful, well intended to make a statement, was also a place for the community to come together. It would be here that they would practice their religion, their customs and traditions. And it would also be here that they would come together from time to time for more secular pursuits, to have town meetings, to lend out charitable aid. The space was intended to be grand. And in its own way, as we head inside, you'll see that what was in this building was quite like nothing else in the neighborhood. To bring you into the space, I think I'll bring you in just as we would were you visiting in person today. As you enter the building, you don't go directly into the main sanctuary. Instead, as open as a museum, you enter into the original basement, also known as the Beit Midrash. This particular level houses a fully functioning sanctuary, one of two in the building, and houses some of the oldest elements in the structure. It also has some of my favorite features. The space is laid out to contain a fully functioning sanctuary. You see the bema here in the center, and I'll get my laser pointer if I can. Maybe I can see if I can. There we go. We have the bema here in the center, a slightly unusual arrangement in Ashkenazi synagogue, at least by modern standards, having the bema in the center. Many times when giving tours for school groups or the public, people will ask about this, and they'll ask me, why is it in the center? That's more typical of a Sephardic congregation, congregations coming from Spain and Portugal, and indirectly sometimes through the Balkans and Southern Europe. I'll tell you what I tell them, which is that this layout with the bema in the center is actually a traditional layout for Ashkenazi synagogues 100 years ago. It's only more recently, in recent times, that the bema is merged with this structure here, the Ark, or the Aron Kodesh. Separated here, it's rather easy to explain their different functions. The bema is where the main place for the services will take place. The Torah will be unfurled up here on the podium, and it will be read here. Whereas the Ark is the structure where the Torah will be stored when not in use. As I said, in modern times, these two structures are often built in proximity to one another, and the podium on the bema is turned around to face the audience. But in this synagogue built in a very traditional style that you would have seen in Europe, the bema is in the center facing the Ark. There is one other element I always love to mention here, although I have to admit it's maybe a little bit hard to see on this image, but it's right here hanging from the ceiling. That's the Ner Tamid. It's the eternal light. It denotes God's presence in the space, and they can come in all different shapes and sizes. So they can have different power sources. Some of them are gas, others electric. Some use batteries. As long as they're always lit, it doesn't quite matter. My favorite piece, though, on this particular level is not the Ark or the Ner Tamid, but it's actually a little facet of the bema itself. This is something that I've heard of being in synagogues before, but I've never quite seen it done in this way. It's this little container which is situated right on top of the bema. It's carved in, and it was put there for opening day. If you were here in person, I would be grabbing the lid right now and removing it, inviting you to come up and take a quick whiff of what's inside, asking for you to guess what might be contained within. Over my 6 years here at the museum, I've heard a litany of different explanations, everything from oregano to Havdalah spices to tea. I've even heard some things that some of my 6th graders come up with, and I'll just tell you they have some wild guesses. I love my 6th grade classes when they come visit. Very few people, in fact, only 20 on my tour have guessed correctly what's inside, and it's understandable because it's so unexpected. What's inside this container is actually connected to 2 rich traditions of the congregation, one religious and one not. Being an Orthodox congregation, one of their traditions was strict observance of Jewish laws, and in particular, Sabbath, the day of rest, Shabbat, as you might also say. During this period from sundown Friday to sundown Saturday, no work will be performed. This includes carrying things in public, handling money, dancing, completing circuits, cooking, turning lights on and off. This would pose a problem in many different areas of life for here in New York, because New York was not in many cases designed to accommodate this religious expression. In the case of work, for example, many factories didn't allow their workers to take off on the Sabbath. They were, at least the Jewish one, they were expected to work from Monday through Saturday, taking Sundays, the Christian Sabbath, off. No accommodations were made in many cases, even by Jewish factory owners. It was just too problematic for the overall supply chain. But in this case, the congregation wanted to create a way to be able to observe their faith while also making things easy. And for this congregation, 100 years ago, which was filled with heavy smokers, they needed to find a way to get their nicotine without lighting a match. They couldn't use a cigar, a cigarette, but they could use chewing tobacco, snuff. And that's what's inside the container. They would come up during services, take some and put it under their lip. It would both give them their nicotine fix and give them a bit of a buzz to stay awake if they needed during services. I'll just break from my tour for a moment and do a little PSA. There's different ways of staying awake if you need to, so do take a look at that. But I do love this piece because it is so unusual. There's very few instances I've ever heard of. In fact, I've heard of none where the container for the snuff is carved into the bima. It's really different. So too, in some ways, is this other accompanying piece. This piece of pottery on the shelf is actually a spittoon. You may recall them from the old Westerns with a guy rocking back on his porch. Every so often, he'll spit into the tin container. This was that same device, though made of pottery with one every row in the congregation's heyday. This would be where the congregants would dispose of their chewing tobacco without needing to spit onto the hardwood floors, or even worse, onto the people around them. You want to avoid that. The very first set of spittoons was actually purchased by the congregation for $8, which sounds like a Black Friday deal, but was actually the average salary, 1 week's salary for a teenage garment worker. And that would amount to over 60 hours of labor, countless different dresses, stitched or ironed or carried, depending on your role. This particular piece, this particular spittoon is among the last the congregation would buy in the 20th century. And if you were with me in person, I would be lifting it right now and pivoting it so I could show you the historic residue that still lines the bottom. I always do like a good euphemism. As we head upstairs, we begin to move into a separate space. The level downstairs was very functional, very utilitarian. They were focused on building a space that could be used. They weren't focused as much on the beauty and the decor and the ornamentation. On this level, on the second level, on the main level of the synagogue, the beauty and the ornamentation and the decoration was in many cases a key factor. And you can tell even from this small room that that is in fact the case. This particular room is the entrance hall, the foyer. It separates the sidewalk, the outside of world, Eldridge Street, which is just through these two doors on your left-hand side, from the main sanctuary, which lies on the right just within. The irony of this room is that if you consider just the floor space, it's almost exactly the size of a tenement apartment 100 years ago. You don't get quite the feel of just how small that is from this image, but it's not a lot of space. As the congregants would pass through these doors and head through into the main sanctuary, I find it both ironic and symbolic, that this would be the place, this spies space would be the one they'd pass through. For it was in this room that they would leave behind all of their day-to-day concerns, everything from their apartment size to its condition, the amount they're making, their ability to observe their customs as they would want to, the other challenges that aren't just about life as an immigrant, but day-to-day life here in America. This is what you would leave behind, checked like a coat on the rack here in the background. Because when you enter the main sanctuary, your focus has to be singular. You're focused on the services happening that day. And you'll understand in a moment, but our space was designed to capture the attention, to fascinate, to awe. It was designed to create something, if you'll pardon the pun, something of a religious experience. And I have to say, I think they did manage to achieve that. This is an image of our sanctuary. Actually, this is taken from the women's balcony, but this is giving you an idea of what the space is like. It is light and air personified. Where tenement apartments were known for being small and with only two windows next to each other with no movement of air, there's nothing but in our space. The main sanctuary, like the building, features 60 stained glass windows on all four walls and even the ceilings, with countless light fixtures, windows that can open, light and air pour into the space. With 50-foot ceilings from the main level all the way to the top of this chain, on the ceiling, you have nothing but air and space. This was like nothing else around it. It was a little pocket, a little bit slice of heaven, you might say, in and amongst the crowded tenements of the neighborhood. I want to show this image too, because I do think this is a fantastic piece. This is an etching taken of the main sanctuary in 1890. It's one of the first images that we have of the sanctuary, both in and not in use. And you can see some of the details, particularly here with the bema and the lovely brass fixtures that are standing here, the cluster of light fixtures that would bring illumination to the space. You can see some of the original stained glass windows and know that almost all of the windows are the original design. And in fact, only 85% of the pieces had to be restored. You can see bits and pieces of the ark, and you can even see the men gravely contemplating their prayers in their top hat and tails, their Saturday best. This piece, like a handful of other pieces, gives us a little glimpse into the congregation in the 19th century. As we'll discuss, however, these pieces don't tell us everything, because there is actually one blank space here that's going to be more critical than the people making this etching in 1890 may have anticipated. We'll discuss a little bit more later. This image I also love to show because this is taken from the main level, just as you pass in through the foyer. And this gives you a sense of the sheer size of the space, of the 50-foot ceilings, of all of the stained glass windows, of the 2 levels. This gives you that sense of what the building was like. This is also where you can see some of the best examples of the architecture. The building is predominantly designed in Moorish Revival. I did mention that outside, but you can see it even more clearly here inside the main sanctuary. The arches and domes, the color palette, the spacing of the building, this is all evocative of what you would see in southern Spain, Portugal, and North Africa. The Ashkenazi community 100 years ago was fascinated by Sephardic history, by that period in the 10th and 11th centuries when Spain, the areas that would become Spain and Portugal, were ruled by an Islamic people called the Moors. It was, for the Sephardim, a golden age. And in the 17 and 1800s, the Ashkenazi community were building their synagogues in this style, in their style of Moorish Revival, hoping perhaps that they would catch lightning in a bottle, that they too might have a golden age of their own. The irony for us here is that the 2 architects that designed this building had never designed anything in Moorish Revival before. In fact, they had never designed any synagogues before. The architects, Peter and Francis Herder, were tenement architects. They exclusively built apartment buildings for the immigrant community here in the Lower East Side. In fact, we have 2 existing examples of their building not too far from us in the area. The Peter and Francis had never built anything in Moorish Revival. In fact, they had never built anything other than tenements, and they had very little experience in synagogues because they were German Catholic. I love this fact because if you put it all together, it means that this is an Orthodox Jewish synagogue built in a Moorish Islamic style by 2 German Catholic brothers. It's pretty much New York in a nutshell. If you put it together with the fact that the construction crew were Irish Catholic, it just underlines that fact even more. One of our great benefits over the past several years is a recent discovery of an article that was written by 2 New York Sun reporters. They had been dispatched by their editors to observe and record the first Passover services occurring in the synagogue in 1888. The words on your screen are their words that they wrote for that article and give us a sense of the congregation as they were 100 years ago. These 2 reporters observed a few of the men reseated in the pews, gravely contemplating the beautifully embroidered curtain before the ark. Most of the congregants were standing in little groups in various parts of the room, chattering vivaciously in Polish, Russian, or German, with now and then a phrase or 2 in some strange dialect that may have been Hebrew or attempted Yiddish. There was little of the subdued tone and manner that characterized the assembling of a Christian congregations for worship. There were no bowing of the head upon the backs of the pews next to the front, no kneeling upon a bench, and recitation of prayer. For the congregants 100 years ago, the space was the space where they could come in some ways to observe their services, in other ways to get away. And I love that quote for capturing that sense of community here in the congregation. As much as this article does tell us, there are other features that are in the room that are my favorite little architectural bits. This is one of them, and you might be asking, why are you showing me an image of the floorboard? I want you to look carefully at the floorboard. This is actually my favorite piece on our tour this evening. If you look carefully, you'll see the floor actually has a bow in it. This is one of countless dips that are in the floor that run like stripes from the left to the right-hand side of the room, and in rows that stretch from the back all the way to the front. This is not the area you might think that the benches are sitting in. This is not depressed from the weight of the benches themselves. Instead, these depressions, these dips in the floorboards, were the spaces in between the benches. This is where the congregants placed their feet. And as they would pray, as they would contemplate the prayers and move, as they would throw their whole selves into the services, davening, rocking back and forth, they would also shuckle, that movement, moving back and forth, throwing their whole selves into the prayers. In the case of their feet, their feet would actually rock back and forth from heel to toe. And over the decades on the soft wood floors of the main sanctuary, they slowly pressed their footprints into the floorboards. And combined, it's those footprints made over decades that leave these tracks running across the boards. Were you here in person, I'd be inviting you right now to step into the dips and place your feet inside the footprints. One of the few places in the city where you can step into these historic footprints made by centuries of use and prayer. Another great element of the space is the wood structures sitting on top of the floor. You can see the benches and even the bema here in this image. The benches, as we'll see, have a rather different, unique element, and there's these three carved out circles. We'll discuss that in a few moments. But I want to focus our attention on these numbers. These are in some ways critical to the congregation, their operations, their day-to-day functioning. For this congregation, like some today, although this is a lot less common, there are still those that do this, this congregation, in order to guarantee your seat here, in order to become a member, you had to buy a seat. The seats got more expensive the closer to the front you would get. In fact, the seats all the way on the eastern wall would run about $1,000 in the 1880s. The average family would earn maybe $435 a year. So this is 3 times the average annual sum. As you move further to the back, the prices would get significantly less. By the time you get all the way to the back, to the worst seats in the house, a feature we'll discuss in a little bit, you would be paying about $200. If you couldn't afford to buy or rent, you would also be able to pay, after a few months, a 25-cent seat tax in order to claim one of the vacant seats on any particular service. We know from the 2 reporters, and I believe we'll be having that quote a little bit later, but there was the space was being occupied both by Ashkenazi Jews coming for services, but also German Jews and non-Jewish New Yorkers. In their own ways, they were all helping to contribute to pay off the $91,000 it took to build. The worst seat in the house, which I mentioned, is connected directly with the particular structure. And I've been on many tours where we're walking inside, and somebody will see this as they walk into the sanctuary, and they'll point at it and they'll ask, why is a confessional here in the sanctuary? And I'll explain to them that though it may look like a confessional, it's actually not one. This structure was put in the 1890s. It was a slightly later addition, and it was put in because the congregation, attempting to pay off the mortgage, had leased out the Beit Midrash to another congregation. They were holding dual services in the synagogue. While that might seem like a good idea on paper, in practice, it did not turn out well at all. And the 2 congregations began to conflict with one another. They would butt heads. And after a certain period of time, they really could not interact at all without it devolving into a dispute. In order to avoid these continuous disputes, the congregants realized that unfortunately they couldn't use the original bathrooms, which were on the floor below. And so they built, right in the back of the sanctuary, their own water closet or outhouse that they could use during services to avoid bumping into the other congregants. It makes this bench right back here much akin to the back seat of a coach bus or an airplane, a multi-sensory experience, you might say. This image, I think it's great as well because you can see some of the detail work on the walls, and this is absolutely worth noting, particularly on this tour this evening. We are featuring architecture because virtually none of the marble panels in the sanctuary are genuine marble. It is almost completely faux, hand-painted to look like marble. You can see if you were to peel the paint back, you would see lath and plaster, old lath and plaster where they had the wooden stripes. They'd smear on the plaster like cream cheese on a bagel, smooth it out, paint it, and design it. The artisans would come in and painstakingly feather on the veins, use straight lines to create what appears to be the separation between panels, and really give the building that sense of majesty in its own way. The congregation would have to find a number of economic measures to build the space because $91,000 was a lot of money. It wasn't a limitless sum. We know that some of the wood structures in the space, such as even this one, are more inexpensive woods which have been stained to look like more premium furniture woods like mahogany or maple. We know, as another example, that the columns that they put in the sanctuary to hold up the ceiling and the balcony level, which we'll be heading to later, were purchased from a company that specialized in creating ship's masts. They simply purchased really tall, sturdy, straight wood masts, and they used them to structure the space. You can see bits of that here in this image. If we move towards the front, you can begin to see, whereas the water closet was a bit more functional than beauty, that the pieces central to the services, the ark, which we'll be looking at in a moment, and this podium here, which was the podium for the cantor and for the rabbi, the congregation really pooled their resources into them. All of these wood features are hand carved. They did not have machine tools at that time. All of this intricate detail work had to be completed over the 9 months. Everything from the different carvings on the side of the wood, the details on the inside, this hardwood railing for people to lean on, and even this adjustable podium, where all of these different bits of scroll work carved into it are actually cut all the way through, allowing light and air to pass, giving it even more beauty. This particular podium was designed for the cantor or the chazan to sing during services. Just like the congregants and those reading from the bima, he would be facing towards the ark, and as is traditional in synagogues, facing towards Jerusalem, towards the Second Temple. The cantor that this particular structure was at least initially designed for was Pinchas Minkowski, later Rabbi Minkowski. Pinchas was considered a rock star of the cantorial world and one of the best tenors in the city. Brought over by the Atlantic by the congregation themselves, he was brought over in an era when there were many synagogues popping up in the Lower East Side, and each congregation was trying to get the best cantor in order to attract members, in order to get membership dues and to pack the seats. Pinchas was considered a rock star of the cantorial world, and he had exactly the intent they were hoping for. As the New York Sun reporters note, they wrote that he was the greatest tenor of whom the Jews are justly proud, and while admittedly the best cantor in America, he might with little fear compete for the distinction of being the greatest tenor in the city. Mr. Minkowski, whispered the Hebrew gentleman to the reporter, is not only a great singer, but a profound scholar also. Our music is getting to be so famous, the same commentator whispered, that rich Jews from uptown come here to worship very often, and many Christians also come here to listen. The visits of the Christians have become so pronounced that the society, the congregation, has found it necessary to levy a tax of 25 cents a head for strangers at the regular Sabbath services. I love this quote, and I always love bringing it into these tours because partly it's giving you a sense of the congregation, of the history, but also in its own way, the roots of our museum, which is designed to talk about this history and customs and traditions for a broad audience. This has been something that's been happening at the synagogue going back over 100 years. And this just underlines that fact. It's worth noting, of course, that Minkowski, while he did get people to come in, he did pack the seats, he did fulfill his contractual mission. He was being paid quite considerably for that, whether he succeeded or not. The congregation gave him an annual salary of $2,500 a year, a princely sum in that era, along with a stipend for home furnishings and first-class tickets for him and his family. Unfortunately, the cantor craze, which had propelled these high salaries, didn't last very long. As more and more immigrants came into the Lower East Side, congregations found it much easier in order to get members, to get those dues that they would need to preserve the space and maintain it. Minkowski's services were not worth as much as they had been, and as the value of cantors went down, he would go to other synagogues and eventually back to Odessa, where he had left from, hoping to find a better environment. That actually wasn't all too uncommon in this era. Many rabbis and cantors didn't like New York City. They preferred being in Eastern Europe. The conditions weren't as good from an economic or religious perspective, freedom perspective. But in Eastern Europe, the rabbis were actually in charge of the congregations, or in the synagogues, it was the board. They took control. They were businessmen. They knew how to run a business. And rabbis in particular also missed the scholarly exchanges that they would have in Eastern Europe, not something that you yet had in America. There simply wasn't enough people and rabbis to support the theological debates that they liked to have from time to time. This brings us to another great feature of the building, these benches, and I really love focusing on these capstone pieces. These are on the ends of the backs of every single bench in the sanctuary. Now you do have in some ways the horseshoe frame around it, which is very evocative of Moorish Revival. But if we look at the wood, it's a little different than the wood of the rest of the space. There is always this question, was it added on? And that may very well be the case. For the design in the interior of this capstone, the three arches that are put together is a rather unusual symbol to be found in a synagogue. A Gothic trefoil. It would typically be found in a church, representing the Christian Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. What it's doing in a synagogue is one of those mysteries we'll never quite solve. Some people, the congregation at least, believed that these pews had been purchased by a church or church catalog as a way of being economical. I personally, though, think the Herder brothers brought it in, because you actually do see other examples of the trefoil put into the building, both in the stained glass in the balcony and some of the brass fixtures. We won't never know for sure exactly why they're here, but it's one of those fun mysteries that we can at least talk about. It also allows us in its own way to put our own spin on this particular symbol. For example, one of my sixth graders gave their preferred answer for what this particular symbol was for. They thought it was a functional piece, a space where the congregants could store their fidget spinners. I had to explain to them at the time that they didn't actually have fidget spinners in the 19th century. They were very disappointed. I also want to point out the stained glass, because there is such beautiful stained glass in our space. You really can't take a tour without mentioning it. And also, of course, the lovely wall designs around it. The stained glass, as I may have mentioned, is all original, almost all original in design. 85% is authentic glass. And I think it's just amazing how many different combinations and designs they managed to achieve with only a handful of colors. If we look at this window on the bottom left hand, for example, you have some yellows, some oranges, green, blue, and red, and they managed to create an entire window around it. If you throw in a few different shades of violet, you could create the window at the top, which is one of my favorites because of the hidden Jewish star here in the center. It's the violet triangles that give it away. You can also see this stained glass window, which is found on the balcony level. The different patterns of circles and rectangles dominate the bottom with, as we saw a few moments ago, the trefoil towards the top. The windows just complement the space in so many different ways. And I wouldn't be able to leave you without mentioning this lovely Gothic rose window on the top right-hand side. Each of the rosettes around the edge of the window has a different Jewish star in them. There are 12, in fact, in total, one for each of the 12 tribes of Israel. Numbers, interestingly, plays a great role in our Synagogue. There are 12 rosettes. There are 5 keyhole windows just below it, unfortunately off screen in this image, for the 5 books of Moses. And there are 4 main doors into the synagogue level for the 4 matriarchs. The congregation at times, I'm going to go back a moment to this image, sometimes would joke that this was for the 3 patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but we're not quite sure. Again, one of those mysteries. Another feature I love is actually something that was never designed, but something came about over time. This particular piece is at the top of the podium, just above where the cantor would have sung. It would be here that rabbis and bar mitzvah boys would come and give their speeches. They wouldn't read from Torah here. This would be speeches or sermons that would come following the reading of Torah or Haftorah. But this particular feature is actually a bit of damage done to the space. Only damage done over many, many years. For this particular spot is the arm rail that goes around the podium, and it is the perfect location for a person to lean with their right hand. The channel is the perfect spot for one's thumb to rest. And given that Hebrew, the language that would have been spoken during the services, would be read from right to left, it's not all inconceivable that this particular detail was made by decades of nervous bar mitzvah boys and angry rabbis sitting there and rubbing away with their right thumb as they read the text from right to left. What I love about this is getting people upstairs and getting to put their thumb in the impression. It's always a special moment. I also want to mention, excuse me, the ark. Because the ark, I think, is one of the most magnificent pieces in the space. All done hand carved. It is designed to look like the facade of the building. You have the horseshoe window and the circles evocative of the Gothic rose window on the front, the finials and orbs with the Jewish stars on the top, and all of the lovely detail scroll work, which is evocative of different floral patterns along with countless Jewish stars. The doors themselves are also pocket doors, which I find fascinating for the late 19th century. And behind the doors is the interior of the ark, and that is where the towers will be kept when services are not in session. This particular ark has a layer of red velvet with a band of gold trim, and it's actually a rather large ark. There's slots for 24 different Torah scrolls, 8 per row with 3 rows. We're not quite sure as to why the ark has its capacity. We think perhaps it may have been that other congregations, as they're pouring into the neighborhood, would have merged into larger congregations. If I can break away from history for a moment and take you back to Earth science class, it's very much akin to the process by which planets are created, as asteroids and other large bodies come together to form larger and larger bodies in space. Much the same way, as smaller congregants merge into bigger ones, they create bigger and bigger and bigger congregations. Was this ark created so those former congregations that had merged into this one had a space for their Torah, so they wouldn't have to give it away or hide it in a closet downstairs? Perhaps. Other people think bragging rights. Ultimately, we will not know. The fantastic part about this particular velvet is that it dates back over 100 years. It is very delicate, very beautiful. And if you stick your hand in the ark, I'll give you a little behind the scenes tip, you can actually feel a temperature difference. The doors are actually thermal broken in some ways because the interior of the ark is actually an extension that juts out the back of the building. That will be critical a little bit later on our tour. I want to bring us next to the balcony space, and the women's balcony is the location where you're going to get to see some of the best visuals of the architecture, where you can see the way the arches and domes come together, how the hand-painted designs are filling up every square inch of the space. This building is very Victorian in its way. You see vacuoria, fear of the void, at play on almost every surface, whether it's the blue field with the 5 pointed stars and the domes, the different floral patterns in the spaces in between, or the foam marble covering every other space. There's a pattern, a carving, a design everywhere in this building. And you can see most of that from the women's balcony. Of course, while the women's balcony had the best view of the architecture, it had some of the worst view of the men down below. This was by intention. Men and women were with a desire, and I'm boiling down centuries of theology and custom and tradition to a very, very bare bones statement. But in essence, the tradition was men and women to be separate so they would be able to pray more effectively. The women in the balcony were separated by the men, both by the separate level and by the metal rail, which we believe to be perhaps original, which went around the edge of the balcony. Now, this metal rail is not a handrail, and every time someone leans on it, my heart begins to beat a little bit. But it is actually a curtain rod, and there would be a mechitza or a curtain hanging from the rod going down to the wood. It would run all the way around the space. It was there to keep the men and women completely separate, so they could not see each other. As you might imagine, the women of the balcony didn't particularly appreciate this, and time again, they actually pushed the curtains off to the side and allowed them to get a better view of the space. And they did this so often that the curtains broke. When the men replaced the curtain, the women broke them again. And they went back and forth, and finally the men didn't replace them. There is one element of the original curtain still on, in fact, the metal rail. Just over here on the left, there's one of the rollers that the curtain was held up on that's still there after all these years. Always little tidbits in our building. Of course, our story wasn't all beauty and design. Beginning in the 1920s, our story would change yet again. In 1924, Congress would enact the National Origins Act, or the Johnson-Reed Law, and this law was intended to restrict immigration to the United States. One member of Congress, a senator, Ellison Durant Smith, spoke rather candidly about why he felt the law was necessary. And as part of his speech, he asked rhetorically what it meant to be an American. He said that to be an American was to be a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. It wasn't to be a descendant of Africa or son of Italy or immigrant from Eastern Europe. And he thought it was time to shut the doors and allow Americans to breed more real Americans, to recapture that source of American greatness, which he identified as our unparalleled, undiluted stock of Nordic blood. Now, granted, this sounds a little bit less like the US in the 20s and a bit more like somewhere else in the 30s and 40s, but the reality is the reality. And immigration would be severely curtailed by the 1924 immigration law. That would have devastating impacts both on the neighborhood and on our building. As fewer and fewer people entered through Ellis Island, and the same number of people moved out to Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, and other parts of the country, the neighborhood would begin to shrink. So too would the congregation. Without members paying for seats, renters renting them for a time, and people paying those 25-cent seat dues, the congregation became less and less able to maintain the structure, to use it, to heat it, to light it. And they began to use the downstairs level more and more, and the main sanctuary less and less. As you can see from these images, Mother Nature would have her due. It was the stained glass and the wall and the ceilings that would go first. Separating and failing, they would allow the moisture and the rain and the dirt and the pigeons and the New York City pizza rats to come inside the space and rip it apart from the inside out, causing the paint and plaster to crack and chip, the wood structure beneath to rot away, and the windows themselves to fall in. By the 1980s, when these images are taken, the sanctuary seems less like a grand synagogue in New York and more like a ruin you might expect to find in Rome and Athens from an eon ago. You can see the devastating state the space was in. The roof was in some ways near collapse. It would take us 20 years and $20 million to bring this space back to what you're seeing. And the vast majority of it is just as the congregation designed it and built it over the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The building itself is set to the paint scheme that the congregation put in 1918. We found a lot of great sections that were left over, that had survived this particular period of destruction, and we were able to use that to put the space to get back together. The restoration itself took 20 years, from 1986 until 2006, and at a cost of $20 million. It allows us to preserve this space for the coming generations as both a time capsule and a center of learning. In some ways, though, I think the best analogy for this building is one that my colleague once used. She called this building kind of driftwood. For like driftwood, it was brought onto the beach by the high tide coming onto shore, and as the tide pulled away, it was left behind, evidence of what was. In its own way, every landmark is like that piece of driftwood, something left behind as evidence of the past, in one way or another. There is one feature, though, that we actually couldn't fully restore to its original look, and that was the window on the eastern wall. The congregation had designed the window in a rather inexpensive fashion, attempting to make ends meet. What window was there, and we actually don't know what the image was put in with a wood structure, not the limestone the western window was put in with. Over the years, the water would penetrate, and the window itself would begin to fail. It was removed in 1945, and in its place, the congregation put these glass blocks, arranged in tablet formation. They sat there from 1945 until 2010. As we redid the restoration, we decided that the window really didn't fit the space and decided to do some historic research and figure out what was there. We did a lot of research and we could not find a single shred of evidence to tell us what was in the space originally. We looked at blueprints, photographs, drawings, etchings, plans. We spoke with people who had been there at the time. In fact, there's that great etching I showed earlier on the tour, made in 1890 by Century Magazine. And I pointed out that blank space, and I said it would be critical later on our tour. That blank space was the very spot where this window once stood. And because it wasn't depicted, we had no way of fully restoring it. We decided to do something a little different, a little modern, something inspired by the space, but something we hoped that the congregants themselves might have picked were they picking the selection. Oops, sorry. The window itself is designed by Brooklyn artist Kiki Smith and uses 1,200 pieces of glass to pull together a stained glass window like none other in the building, or indeed in most of New York City. Shifting from yellow to white to blue with stars of blue, violet, and gold, the window is supposed to mirror the blue fields with yellow painted stars that you find in the domes, original to 1918. But virtually everything else is modern, from the steel frame to the liquid silicone that holds the individual pieces together. You can see those in the cracks in between the blue sections. Ultimately, Kiki herself saw this window as representing the Big Bang with God at the center. But many people have had different explanations over the years. Some people see it as the sun rising in the sky, others as a galaxy spinning on its axis. I did have one sixth grader, though, suggest to me that it looked kind of like a blueberry smoothie being made in a blender. I haven't been able to get that one out of my head. That one sticks. With that, I want to begin to take us a little bit outside the building. For as historic as our building is, and I certainly think it is, there are a lot of other great landmarks in the Lower East Side, and each has their own story to tell. Our first stop on this little walking tour for this evening is the Jarmulowsky Bank. You can see it depicted in 1912 just after it opened on the right, and an image of the man who built it on the left. Sender Jarmulowsky was one of the wealthiest men in the Lower East Side 100 years ago. In fact, he would be eulogized when he passed in 1914 as the J.P. Morgan of the neighborhood. He also served as the president of the Eldridge Street congregation when it first opened its doors on Eldridge Street. He was one of the main driving forces pushing the building to be made. His own career, his own life had started, in fact, in modern-day Poland, and he had started early in his academic career studying to become a rabbi. But he quickly decided that he did not want to pursue religious study. Instead, he became a businessman, a travel agent, selling tickets to immigrants crossing the Atlantic. By the 1870s, he had raised so much money in this business that he decided that rather than putting his money in a bank, he would start one of his own. The Sender Jarmulowsky Bank opened its doors in 1873 and quickly became one of the more prominent banks in the neighborhood. Located on the same spot that this more recent building was located on Orchard and Canal, his banking business quickly became an international concern, with satellites in Hamburg and Bremen. He was still selling tickets amongst the teller windows, and it proved to be an excellent combination for the people of the neighborhood. They could save up their money right there in the bank, and when they had enough, they could take it 2 windows over and buy the tickets for their siblings, aunts, uncles, or cousins to cross the Atlantic. When this second iteration of the bank building opened in 1912, it did so to great fanfare, with a ticker tape parade which marched down Canal Street. This bank was unique, not just because it hosted the tallest building in the Lower East Side, and a interesting title if there was one, but it was also a bank that unusually survived bank panics in this era. In a period before the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, if a bank were to have a rumor spread that it was going to collapse, the depositors would pull their money as fast as they can. For without federal insurance, they would lose every cent. Jarmulowsky was one of the few bankers that was able to convince the panicking depositors to keep their money with him. His business acumen, his honesty, his integrity, which most in the neighborhood believed in, was for him the currency of the realm. It allowed his bank to survive. Unfortunately, it did not do the same for his sons when they took over in 1912. The bank building quickly collapsed. The bank quickly collapsed, and the building would be used for a variety of purposes over the many years. It was used as office space, factory space. There was a Chinese restaurant in there at the time. But more recently, the building underwent a grand restoration that took many, many years. And they actually went well beyond the estimated construction point. There's I love this fact. When I was giving walking tours in front of the building, you would see the sign that said estimated completion summer of 2016, and that 2016 completion sign was posted well until 2019. It had gone well past their estimated construction period. But in fairness to them, I think it was because they were doing such a great job. The folks that redid 9 Orchard, as it's now known, spent a lot of time and effort restoring things they weren't legally required to do. A New York City landmark, the landmarking had been issued after the dome and much of the detail work here on the upper levels had fallen away. They put wood frames on the windows. The company that designed it is actually a historical restoration business, and they were using the space both as an interesting avenue for business expansion and also as a way to help train their crews on how to do this very labor-intensive and skilled job. The hotel and restaurant that there is today is very beautiful, and I was particularly pleased to learn that the original bank lobby ceiling, which you'd find just inside this corner door here, which was uncovered, had been covered by drywall for almost 100 years, was preserved by the new tenants, and actually they designed the restaurant around it. So I'm really happy that they did that. They also added this little cupola a little bit later, and we will be talking about this a little bit later on our tour tonight. For our next stop, I want to take us to a space that kids love to talk about. The Jarmulowsky Bank, I find it fascinating. I hope you found it fascinating. But for my school groups, when I give tours, they really don't care about banks. It's not something that factors into their day-to-day oftentimes. And this was no different than kids 100 years ago. As children in the neighborhood began to go to work, as they were earning money, as they gained disposable income, their new interest was finding a way to dispose of that income quickly. The bank was not what most people focused on. Instead, they wanted a more instant return. It was in this particular location where they would find that instant return. The Loew's Canal Street Theater, as this building was known, was one of the major movie theaters of its era, with seating for over 2,600 people and air conditioning to keep them cool in the summers. This building was an anchor for the neighborhood. Beautifully designed with Art Deco features, a massive star on the ceiling, a chandelier hanging from under it. This building was built in the great tradition of the movie Palace. Unlike its less expensive Nickelodeon, the Nickel Theater, the movie Palace was supposed to be grand and epic, supposed to be akin to a theater that you'd see on Broadway or something in London on the West End or even in Paris. From the facade, you can see elements of that grand movie palace still peeking through. On the front, you can see everything from fleur-de-lis and Tudor roses to winged lions and griffin heads, and the scroll work on the side has lovely depictions of the faces of comedy and drama. Ultimately, though, my favorite fictitious part of the facade are the windows. You can actually see here on the right-hand side, they're painted on, they're fake. The theater would be the start of many future actors and comedians' careers. In fact, one of the more famous attendees of this theater, patrons of this theater, was a gentleman by the name of Jerry Stiller, who you may have heard of, who played George's dad on Seinfeld. And for younger audiences, they would know him as the father of Ben Stiller of Zoolander and Madagascar fame. In its own way, this theater was an anchor for the community, a place where they could go and enjoy the space, where they can go enjoy a theater, they can see movies that were being made and environments well beyond their neighborhood. And on Sundays, when the theater would offer a double feature with cartoons and newsreels in between, it would be a great resource for parents who would drop the kids off at would drop kids off at 10 a.m. and come back to pick them up at 3. Always a great thing for 5 cents to boot. Unfortunately, the marquees of the Loew's Canal Street Theater are long gone. You can see 2 different iterations of them. The one here on the left is from the 1930s and has a more curved design. The one on the right, on the other hand, is a bit more blocky, a bit more rectangular. One is taken in 1942. We can date it from the picture being played, For Whom the Bell Tolls, starring Gary Cooper and Ingrid Bergman. But what you can see is in glimpses and elements is that much of the facade which stands there today is still in existence. You can see it a little bit from the side here on this left-hand image and a little bit in the shadows on the right. The other great element of this particular image is that you can see New Chin's Chop Suey and a store selling items for Sukkot. So on this little strip of the Lower East Side, you have a movie theater, Chinese restaurant, and Jewish store, only in the Lower East Side. This is an image actually of the interior of the theater in its golden age, and you can see all of the great detail work that went into it. The screen itself is just this section right here. Everything from the way the curtains are done and the building is rendered, even the organs on either side, it was done immaculately. It was done beautifully. Unfortunately, much of that is beginning to fade, and this photo is about 10 years old now. So I'll say the damage is much more far done. You can see where the organs have been removed. The wall is completely collapsed on the right-hand side, and it's beginning to affect the ceiling. The building, as I understand it, was used for a time as a warehouse, and I know the building's now condemned, so I don't know what it's currently being used for, and I don't know if there's any restoration efforts underway. It would be lovely to save this particular theater, historic and beautiful to boot. Even more fascinating, and my favorite piece here is the lovely chandelier with the 6-pointed star, excuse me. I think it's just a beautiful architectural feature, just absolutely gorgeous. I have one more stop for you this evening before we come to questions, and I think this is a really great stop because it shows in some ways that the history of the Lower East Side is not just contained within the few square miles of the neighborhood. This particular building is the Jewish Daily Forward, and it was the home of the Forward newspaper. The Forward was the most widely read newspaper in its day, with over 300,000 copies published between its English, Yiddish, and Russian editions. The paper was socialist by perspective and was agitating for many of the social justice issues of its day, including women's suffrage, child labor, housing rights and conditions. And they would be the first to admit that. In fact, on the facade of the building, and I think I'll have this image for you later, are the images of the forefathers of communism, Marx and Engels included. In actuality, though, this building, which was built in 1913, was in some ways superfluous before it was even erected. The Jewish Daily Forward had been quite happy at their previous site. This building was not, strictly speaking, necessary for their expansion or their continued operations, but it was built because of the building just a few blocks down the road, the Jarmulowsky Bank. When the Jarmulowsky Bank opened, it was the tallest. He could not stand the idea that the capitalist bank building was the tallest in the neighborhood. Their solution was to build a taller building. Jarmulowsky quickly responded in his own way. he added the cupola to make his building taller once more. That story, which took place in the 1910s, echoes a story, or in maybe some way presages a story that would happen in the 1920s. And you may all know of this story with the Chrysler building, how the spire and spike was built in secret and jacked up to make it the tallest building in the world. It's a great example of native-born architects copying something Lower East Side immigrants were doing 10 years earlier. Here we can see some of the great detail work on the facade. And again, all of these stops today are landmarked, special and historically preserved for good reason. You can see where they've carved forward building into the facade. The U is rendered as a W. They're doing it in that very traditional Latin design. You can see some stained glass windows and some carvings which have the torch as a main feature. The torch, like socialism in the newspaper, was supposed to light the way forward. And it was from that saying that the newspaper took its name. You can also see the four effigies here on either side. This building, while landmarked today, is of course no longer the home of the Jewish Daily Forward. It is now a multi-million-dollar luxury condo, preserved on the interior and preserved on the exterior and redone on the inside. Just a little ironic given the people carved into the front. With that, I think with that, we come to our conclusion today. I do want to thank you all for coming and listening in on this presentation. We had a lot of ground to cover between our building and tour and walking tour. I hope you've gotten a glimpse of the architectural elements of the building and a bit of the history as well. Before we come to questions, I do just want to mention the Lower East Side Preservation Initiative's website at www.lespi-nyc.org, as well as our own website at www.eldridgestreet.org. You can find a lot of great programming on whether it's architecture and preservation or Jewish customs, history and tradition between these two organizations. And I do hope you have a chance to come and see it. With that, I'm going to stop my presentation. And I know we had a number of questions coming through the chat, and I want to get to those first, and then we might have an opportunity for some vocal questions. One anonymous attendee asked, why would someone come to daven wearing a top hat instead of a kippah? So interestingly enough, I believe that the hat would be sufficient in lieu of the kippah to cover one's head. It is also possible they're wearing one under the top hat. People would come to synagogue back then in their best clothing. The men in their top hat and their morning coats. The women would come in their Saturday best with their best jewelry. It was a place to see and be seen. Particularly if you were sitting on the eastern wall, you would be in full view of the congregation. So it was a place to put on, you might even say put on airs. One anonymous attendee asked if it was recorded. I believe it is being recorded, and so it will be posted, I think, on the LESPI website, but I'll let Helena speak to that a bit more. And some folks thanked us for the presentation. I want to thank everyone, and I hope you enjoyed it tonight. I don't know, Helena, if you have questions or if other people have questions and want to chime in, whether they can type it in the chat box. I do see a couple of people raised their hands, so maybe we can get that. So, Helena, you're muted.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Is Steve Tepperman, are you still here? We can allow you to ask your question if you'd like. If you want to ask your question, you need to unmute. Okay, I am not able to get you to speak. So if you're still here, Steve, maybe you can type your question into the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. So while we're waiting for other people to get their nerve up to ask questions, I just want to thank you. That was fantastic. And what an amazing building. You can feel how it would fill you with spirituality just walking in the door, and how very lucky you are to be able to work there every day. I mean, what an amazing space. That is just fabulous.
Thank you. It is. It's a great museum and a great place to work.
It truly is. And one of the most wonderful things that I think you spoke about was the the love that is worn into the building. So the thumb rest and, the area where people were rocking back and forth. Just fantastic history, and to have that worn into the building. I think of it as loving the building and keeping that history alive. So, and I do agree with you that the Loews Theater would be just an amazing space to renovate. I can't imagine how much it would cost. And I'm just wondering if you might say a word or two about the importance of landmarking to your building and keeping that alive.
Absolutely. So landmarking serves a great number of roles for our building and for many others. Of course, there's the usual recognition of the fact that being a landmarked building does give it a certain authenticity to it. The city has done research and they've certified it. But I think the most important thing, of course, is the element of preservation that is in the space. By being landmarked, it ensures that the building will be maintained as it is and won't be altered when in so doing destroying the historic character of the space. And while certainly we as the museum as one of the custodians of the building would hope to never do anything that would undermine its architectural and historic integrity, it does give both us, the city, and the community the surety that the building will be preserved as a historic site for many, many years to come.
Yeah, keeping that history alive, it's just so important. I think we may have another couple of questions that have come in.
Absolutely. So Lynn is asking if there's an active congregation today. So Lynn, there is a congregation attached to the building. They're in a bit of state of flux right now. They're not currently holding services. Unfortunately, I really don't have too great of an answer for you on that tonight because we are actually separate organizations. We co-inhabit the building. So I really don't know what their plans are. I just know that they're not presently holding services. Rebecca is writing that she toured the synagogue with my YIVO Yiddish class in 1988. We were told the synagogue had been a stop on the Underground Railroad and were shown where people were hid. I'd love to know more about this. So, Rebecca, since the building was built in the 1880s, I don't think the building itself would have been a stop on the Underground Railroad, but it's certainly possible that the buildings that existed on the site were. I unfortunately don't have that particular bit of history on hand, but it's certainly something I can dig into, and I will share around with LESPI and others if we can find it. And then Robert's asking, where did most of the restoration money come from and upkeep now? So Robert, the restoration resources came from a variety of sources. It was done grants from various city, state, federal, and corporate and private donors. It was individual contributions as well as hard hat tours. As Rebecca indicated, she's toured the building in the 80s, and that was really before most of the restoration work had been done. We used to do hard hat tours of the synagogue at that time, and you can come in and see the building half restored and half ruined. And it was a lot of those types of programs and tours that helped us rebuild the space. As to today, it's a combination of similar grants, but also a lot of our program revenue, everything from our private and public tour admissions to our concerts and lectures. I know Maya mentioned some at the top of the program. A lot of those programs help support the museum and its ongoing preservation efforts, even more so if anyone's looking for something to do on June 16th on Father's Day. We'll be having our egg roll, egg cream, and empanada street festival, which celebrates the three cultural communities in the neighborhood: Jewish, Chinese, and Puerto Rican. Always great food and a great time. Lernahan is asking, does the museum have events or workshops? Absolutely. We have programs all the time, whether we're working with partners like LESPI or working through our own. If you head to our website, we have our events calendar page. We're going to be having a program this Sunday in honor of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. We'll be having concerts throughout the year, as well as other virtual and in-person programs. Michelle says, I had heard the restoration was funded by individuals and community groups, not by commercial organizations. This is correct. Also, I thought the Loew's building was landmarked some years ago, unfortunately only externally. So yes, I can confirm that the Loew's Canal Street Theater exterior facade is landmarked, but not the interior. Very unfortunate. If I misspoke earlier, I apologize. There's no commercial donations. What I meant to say is essentially non-for-profit foundations. So it was donations from charitable organizations giving money for purposes of restoration, education, etc. So no, the only corporate sponsorship I believe I'm aware of is some money that American Express gave as part of the Kiki Smith window project. And I will just say for the record, that's not why the window's blue. It's not why. And then Rebecca says, not hard hat, but it was a wreck. Incredible to see how it had been restored. Well, Rebecca, I hope you have, and I hope everyone has a chance to come and see the space in person. The photos, some of them I took, some of them other people took, can only do the space so much justice. And you really have to step into the space to feel it. There's really nothing quite like it. Anna Haddad writes, not a question, just a reminder that today, sadly, being given landmark status is no longer a guarantee of preservation. Witness what we're experiencing at the Merchants House Museum. I know that's certainly a controversy right now, and landmarking is not seamless. There are gaps. I'm originally from Queens, and so I used to go through Flushing and see the old RKO Theater, which is condemned now and had been landmarked. I'm told, and I don't have this authoritatively, but I'm told that it was burned down as a result of arson, and it was the owner's second attempt to burn the building down to get around landmark status. Not sure on that, but that's what I understand. So I do know that landmarking can be tedious, there are loopholes through it. And I think it's really great that organizations like ours and organizations like LESPIs are continuing to advocate for landmarked buildings so that we can preserve this history for the coming generations. I think that's it on the questions. If there's any others, Helena, if you have any other questions for me.
I think I'm good. Anyone else? Okay, well, I want to thank everyone for participating this evening, and especially for Scott for that just amazing presentation. That was just so wonderful. Someone asked if we would be, if we're recording this, and yes, absolutely, we have recorded this, and you will be able to see it on our YouTube channel, and you can find those recordings on our website. That's at lespi-nyc.org, but you can just type in LESPI, usually it comes up. And I hope that you keep an eye on our website for future LESPI programs, and of course, museum programs as well. And you can follow us on all of our social media, on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to keep up to date with what's going on with LESPI and with preservation on the Lower East Side. And of course, I'll also ask you to please make a donation if you can to LESPI. We're only able to produce free programs like this wonderful program this evening, and to continue our advocacy work through your generous donations. So thank you for donating if you can. You can find a donate button on your original invitation or on our website. So with that, I want to thank everyone for joining us this evening. Thanks, Scott and Maya, and I hope that everyone has a wonderful evening. Have a great evening, everyone. Thank you.